Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to implement a save and load button for the game that we're building here called Minesweeper. So in previous tutorials we created a game that looks like this here. We can change all of the properties of our cells. I can right click and choose a flag. So my flag in this one is a gray item. Now the magic here and the new part is the save button. So let's say I put flags on everything on the top row and make a unique pattern here that will be easy to remember. So we've got this pattern here. So I'll save it. Okay, now when I push the save button I get a status message that said this is all of the properties of all the buttons. You can see that the first button is true, which is green, and it has a flag on it, which makes it a gray thing. And so that pattern there should be saved now. So let's close the app. And so we've lost the game now, apparently. It's been lost to memory. And I'm going to restart it. All right, so let's get the right URL in there. So we've got button again. So we have randomness on our board again. Now I'm going to choose load. And it says the results are done. Here, let's push return. And we're back. So it did save the results that I had from the previous game. So that's what we're going to try to build. Let's go take a peek at some of the things that are in this app. So let's close here. So a couple of things we're going to build first of all. Here is a database table called games. So let's open it up, see what it is. So games is a very simple database. It has a row called ID and a column called game string. And you can see we've got some properties that are here. So we're going to define that in a minute. Let's see what's in the database. So I'm going to right click and choose view data. What did we put in our database? So we have a string which looks like a Json object. So if I make that really wide, you can see that there's a whole bunch of games that have been saved and then all of the states that have just been shown on the screen. So that's what's being put in the database. All right, so let's take a look around and see what's in this project that's new. Let's go look in this folder called utility and we'll find something called GameState DAO. And so GameState DAO is a data access object. It has a method called getGameState, and let's close that down. And we have another method called saveGameState. And so it's working with this new object called GameState. Well, let's go see what that looks like. So GameState is probably in the models area. There it is, GameState. And GameState has two things. It has an ID number and it has a JSON string. So just like the database has an integer for the ID number and a string called GameState or something like that, GameString, it's the same kind of data type. So an integer and a string. Let's go see what we did in the controller. So button controller. So the first thing we had was a constructor. Let's collapse that. Then we had the index method. Let's collapse that. Last video we created this button click and on right button click. Let's see if we can collapse those. Alright, so here's the new stuff. So we have a method called onSave. So that relates to the button that's going to be on the screen and onLoad. And we'll be coding this in just a minute. So let's get started with a step-by-step of how all of this is going to work. So I've reversed my project back to where it was at the beginning of the video. So there's no database or anything here. We're going to start from scratch. The first thing I want to do is find the database. So let's go to View and choose SQL Server Object Explorer. And so you should have a SQL Server here. So if you don't have this database, you can create one if you click on the project name or this button 2 and you choose Add Item, and then you should choose Data and you can choose a SQL Server database. So you might have one already. If you don't, you can add one here. So I'm going to cancel because I already have one in this project. Let's go see what's in my database. So let's go open the first database and there's a tab called Databases and Test. And then we open up Tables and we can see that I had something from other projects. I have products and users. So we're going to have to add a new database. So let's go and right click on Tables and choose Add a New Table. So let's add some information. So the ID is already given to us. And then we're going to have something called game string as the second. And we need to give this thing a pretty big text field. So this is important. Instead of using varchar or whatever else, I'm going to just pick text, which is almost like an unlimited amount of string because these will be pretty long strings. Also, we're going to change this ID. We want this to be an auto increment thing. So if we come down into the properties and we have a section called identity specification. Now this is really annoying if you don't remember to do this. Identity specification means auto increment. So why do they call it that? I don't know, but let's open it up. And by default, it is not auto increment. It is not an identity. So let's change that from false to true. And now it says the identity seed. What's the first number it's going to pick? 1 will be fine. So let's save it as that. Okay, so we got an ID, and we have game string, and not null, text, integer. It looks like it's all pretty good. So let's choose update. And it's going to update our database. And hopefully there's no errors. Okay, so now we have a new table called table. Why did I ask for table? I don't want table. I want this thing to be renamed. So let's rename it as games. There we go. And it says, oh, you can't rename it. You have to complete the definition and close the window and try again. Okay, let's click OK. Let's go ahead and change this to the word games. Games. And let's try update now. And try it again. Okay, so now we got games and we got table. Well, let's close this and then delete table. We don't need that one apparently, so I renamed it incorrectly. So the database now has games in it. Let's do a right click and check to see what data it has. So let's choose view data. And there is nothing there, so null and null. We're ready to start. Hi. In this video, I'm going to show you how to implement a save and load button for the game that we're building here called Minesweeper. So we're going to create the database access object now. So that would be a good folder for utilities, and I don't see utilities here yet. So let's do a right click and choose and add a new folder. I'm going to name it utility, and then inside there we're going to add a new class. And so that class is going to be a new database access object. So I think games DAO seems like a good name. So we're going to need two different methods for this DAO. One called save game, another one called load game. So this will be the bare minimum of how to make this work. We'll just have two functions. So if I'm going to save something, I need a piece of data to save. So let's create something called a game object. And game object will be defined here in another file. So the game object's job is just to hold the information that's goes in and out of the database. So we'll have two properties. We'll have the ID, and we need a string. So I think we can name the string anything we want. I'm going to call it Json string. And then we have to have a constructor too, so we can add and remove these things from a list. So we've got ourselves the entire game object now. So I can close this. And let's come back into our methods that we were working on with the database. So we're going to get this thing called game object, and then we're going to put it into the database. Now let's see. We're expecting to return a Boolean value. So that's why he's got a red underline there text. So we're going to have a return. And for right now, I'm going to put in return true. So that way we assume that we succeed. We'll change that later. So when we work with the database, we need something called a connection string. So we will define a string and we'll call it that. So let's go to the test database, it looks like. We'll go to test and let's look for connection string. And there it is, it's down in the properties. So let's right click and copy and bring it back into our method here and paste it. So that whole long complicated string is going to connect us to the database. So after the connection string, let's come up with a query string. So it's going to be another string, and we'll call it query string. Now this is the Sql command. So this is the format of a Sql string. We're going to insert into the table, and then we'll put in the column names and then the values. So let's check out what those column names are. So let's go back here. It was called game string and ID. So I don't have to worry about ID. I can just put in game string. Then the second parameter is going to be an @game string. So this is using prepared statements. So we define a placeholder here, and then we'll add a value to it later. So the statement that we're looking for next is we're going to be using a connection. So we'll have a using block, And Sql connection is how you import this. That's the class name. So we'll create a new Sql connection, and the parameter that it needs is the Sql connection string that we defined up here on line 13 or 14. Of course, we have to import this, so let's check the using statement as well. So the next statement is we're going to do another using statement. And this time we're going to be using a command, a Sql command. So we'll create a new instance of it. And then it requires two parameters. One is the connection string and the other is the query string. And let's see, what's the matter here? It looks like we have a problem. It says argument 2 cannot convert from string to the Sql connection. All right, so he's still not happy. It says you're trying to get a connection string. Oh, okay, well I did that wrong. So the connection is this thing right here, Sql connection. So let's copy and overwrite that one. And now are we happy? Okay, computer, you're happy. Good, let's keep going. All right, so this next statement is going to associate this GameString object that we put into our query string with an actual value. So it's called Sql Command.parameters.add. And so we'll identify that GameString is the item that we're talking about. Then the next item is to tell it what kind of a data type that we're associating with. So this is a SQL database type text. So then we want to be able to associate a value with this. So we'll say .value equals. Now where is this value coming from? Well, it's the parameter called GameObject. And GameObject has a string. Now there's one other thing that we could do to modify this. This pathway here is a little bit longer than it needs to be, so I'm going to select these first two items and delete. And then we should get red text. Sure enough, it says underline. And it says I don't know what that is, so let's do import or using system data. So it'll add a new line up here, and this will shorten up this line. Now, we should have a successful association here because we have a string coming in here, and we're associating it with this parameter. So now we're going to get started with the actual execution. So we need to tell it to make the open connection to our SQL database, and then don't forget to close it. And in between these, we'll put our command. So if everything works great, this will run. However, we could probably add a try catch here because sometimes connections don't work and sometimes our queries are written incorrectly. Imagine that, to make a syntax mistake on a SQL statement. So to make sure that this doesn't crash our program, let's put a try and a catch around it so that way we can make sure that it's all successful. Now, we have promised that we are going to return a Boolean value on save game. So a Boolean value could be a true or false. So let's say true if it's successful. So let's create a value now in here called success. So success will initially be set to false. And if this database is executed correctly in the try statement, we can assume that it worked. So we'll set it to true. And then we'll do a return at the bottom that says we'll return success. Now inside the catch statement, we're interested in handling any errors that occur. And so we will do a console. If we had a console we could get to, and then we would see a message that says failure. But more importantly, let's set the debug to right line. So we'll have to import debug, which is part of system diagnostics. And then I'm going to e.message, print that, which is going to tell us if there was a problem, it'll give us more information. All right, so that kind of gets us to the point where we have a success and a save game statement. So maybe this is a good spot to stop. We're going to take the next video to finish off with load game and then put some methods into our actual buttons, and we'll continue on with this process of creating and saving a game. Hey, welcome to part 3 of our application where we are demonstrating how to save a JSON string into a database. So in previous videos, we've created some work here with the DAO object, or the data access object. So we created this save game item. Now I'm going to test it out and see if it works. We have to first of all fix an error before we leave this DAO, which is the load game. So we need to return something. So I'm just going to return true, even though we're not loading a game. But we'll come back to that and fix it maybe in a future video. But for now, we need to get a button to work to see if we can get this save game function to run. So to make save game work, we need both the button and we also need the method in our controller. Let's start with the button. So let's go into the views called button and let's see what we can do there. So down here at the end, just before the last part of the page, we're going to include a new form. So since we already have a form on this page, I'm going to copy the items from line 62 and paste it down here. Let's change this to a new method. So the only item in this form is going to be a single button. So we'll have it as a submit type, and we'll give it a name called save game, and let's see what works. While we're here, let's also copy and paste this so we can have the load game. And we can make a few changes to it, and we will have a load button ready to go. So let's run the application, and as soon as you see the app on the screen, you see we have two buttons. We have a save game and load game. Now if I click one of these, we probably will get an error because it's saying that the requested URL is on save. We have not configured that in our controller yet, so we'll have to fix that now. So the controller is expecting an unsave event. Let's go look at the button controller. So we're in button controller now. Let's go ahead and check out all the methods. So we have a constructor we can hide, we have index, and we have the on button click and on right button click. So I'm just shrinking all of those so we don't have so much stuff on the screen. So the first thing we have to do is create a method. We'll make it public and type action result. We'll call it onSave. We'll have to return something, so we'll return a view, and we'll have to name this view something like results view. So since we're going to be saving a game, we need to invoke an instance of the database object. So we'll have games DAO as the type, and we'll create a new instance of it. So in order to use the game DAO, we need to have a game object. So the game object, remember, has an ID number and it has this JSON string. So we're going to have to instantiate one. Now you notice that I have a red underline that says you need to put in two things here. So we need to put in an ID number, so let's just default it by 1. And now we need the JSON string. So how do we get the JSON string? All we have is this thing called buttons. That's the state of our game. So I want to convert buttons into a serialized object. So in order to convert this list of buttons into a serialized string, we need a new dependency. So let's go to our solution, right-click, and go to our Nuget packages. So manage Nuget packages is what I'm looking for. Now I can choose installed or browse. The one that I'm looking for is this Newtonsoft JSON. Now I don't know how that Nuget managed to guess that I would want this next, but that's the first thing on the list. So let's just click install and see if it works. Alright, so it looks like it's installed, so I'm going to close the package manager and come back into my code. So what I'm looking for now is something called JSON convert dot. And it still doesn't recognize that it's here, but I should be able to import something. Here it is. It recognized this as something from Newtonsoft JSON. So I'm going to select that. And now I have this class available to me. So what are the properties or methods? We have deserialized object is the first one. I think I probably want serialized object. So let's choose that. Now serialized object will take a thing, like a list of buttons, and we'll turn it into a JSON string. So we are passing in a string and an integer, which is exactly what a game object is supposed to have. Now we should be able to send this game object into our database access object, or games DAO. So we'll use the save game method. Now remember that this method was defined to have a return value of true or false. So if it successfully inserts some data, we should get a true. Let's save that as a value called success. Now when I go to the results page, I should probably inform the user if it were successful or not. So I'm going to pass in a Boolean. Alright, so that's pretty much all we have to do to save something. But we should see the results on the next page. So we don't have a next page called results. Let's see if we can create one. So I'm going to right-click and choose Add View and just give it the name of results. Now we should see at the new views area, we should see a results view. and we have some starter code. Now, since we're passing in a Boolean, we need to tell it at the very first line of our view that that is the type of the model that's coming in. This is going to be a very simple view. All we're going to say is either success or failed. And so we'll check the model to see what its value is, and we'll use an if statement. So this is a really simple page, but let's see if we can make it work. Let's run the program. So let's get to the correct URL. So I'll put in button, and I've got our buttons up here. So let's try the save game. So I click here. It says it was successful. Well, isn't that interesting? So if I go back, let's change a few things. I'm going to change everything to red and then try to save it again. And it saved it again. Let's see if it actually worked. So to test this out, I'm going into DBO Games and let's choose View Data. Right click and choose View Data. And then I'm going to push the refresh button. And you can see that I've saved 4 different games now. So I clicked a few times before I tried this video to make sure it worked. And if I look at the last one here, everything should be false. So we got state is false, 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 false. That one seems to be the last one that I saved. So that seems to be working. So I would like to add a little bit more information to the success page or the results page. So I am going to put together a duo or a tuple. So a tuple is going to be a pair of Boolean and string, and we'll call it the results tuple. So the Boolean value is going to be the success variable, which is what we passed before. And then the second item in the list is going to be the list of all of the Json object. It's going to be the list of all the button states. So then when we go back into the results page, we should change the model from a Boolean, a simple bool, to this tuple format, which is already defined in the previous controller. And so this will then allow me to check to see if the results are successful, and then I'm going to print item 2, which is the string. So that's what a tuple will do for us. We can put 2 items in one parameter. Now let's switch back into the button controller, because when I return these results, I should return the results tuple to go with it. So we've got ourselves something ready to go. Let's test it out again. Okay, so we've got some kind of a game state. Let's go ahead and push save. And we have a success, and now you can see that the second item in the tuple was the actual string that got saved to the database. So that's not really necessary, but it's a nice check to see if your stringification or JSONification is working properly. So the next thing we have to do is to go the other direction. We have to deserialize an item and get it from the database. So that sounds like a good topic for the next video. Hi, welcome back to another video for this button game that we're making. In the previous video we had a save game button, which was able to take all of our states of our buttons and put them into a JSON object. In this video we're going to do the load game button. So to make this load game button work, we're going to have to create another item in our database access object. So let's get started there. So I'm here in the code for the game. Let's go to the game DAO, or games DAO, and you can see that we've implemented save game and we have not implemented load game. So that's the goal here. So since these both are going to have a lot of similar code, I'm going to copy and paste over top of the load game. So we can use a few things here and delete a few things. So the first thing that we can change is the query string. The connection string can probably just stay the same, but the query string should be select star from the table, DBO games. So I'm going to modify the query string. I want to get just the first result, or in this case the last result that was in the database. And then I want to, so I'm going to select the top one. And then at the other end of the query I say order by ID and put it in descending order. So the biggest ID number will be at the top of the list. So I'll just get the latest ID number. So this will only select one row. So we're not going to have to use any parameters because we're not specifying any inserts in this command. So I'm going to delete that row. Now in here we're going to see we have an execute non-query. That's probably not going to work, so I'm going to delete that. We can leave the others. Also, let's go and change the return type now. So when we have load game, we expect this thing to come back as a game object. So the game object holds the status here. Notice also it's complaining that it says not all paths return a value. So let's insert a new game object. We just have to create one, and we will use the constructor that says, hey, make one for me. And I didn't create a defaulted constructor, so I have to add some parameters. So let's do one and an empty string. So now we have a new game object. We will fill that game object with things from the database. Now we need to return this at the end of the function here. So let's click on this bracket and follow it all the way down. So that is the end. So just before the end, we're going to do return game object. Okay, so now that error goes away. All right, so inside the try, we're going to need a new SQL data reader object, it's called. So let's call it SQL data reader. And then we need this Sql Command and .execute reader. So that will give us an object that has read from the database. So then we're going to start a while loop. So this is standard functions when you do database reading. So while we can read from the SQL data reader object, while there's a new line, or new row you might call it, we're going to assign that then to our game object. So game object ID is the first thing, and we need to get from position 0. So that's column 0. And then in the database, we're going to have column 1 as well. So we'll have SQL reader for get string the next time, and we'll stick that into the game object.json string. So this should just read one row, but it's set up to read multiple rows, even though we have a while loop here. Okay, so as I look at the code here, before I finally move on, I notice I have an error. So the open statement must be executed before we try to do a read. So I'm going to just cut that out and move it up one line and paste it. Okay, I'm going to save that, and then we're ready to move on. Now it seems like there's one thing that is not really necessary here. I have this success value I can take out, and then down on the next row, 76, it looks like we can eliminate it there as well. So this should return to us a string and an ID, and it'll come in the form of this game object. Now, to be able to use that, let's switch back to the button controller. So we are going to have another function that will be a lot like the onSave function. So I'm going to copy and paste this and call it onLoad. So onLoad is the new guy. So we're going to connect to the database service. We are going to, instead of serialize an object, we're going to deserialize the object. So let's modify that a little bit. So I'm going to highlight a section here and just delete it. So we're going to take a game object and get it directly from the DAO, which is going to get us load game, and it has no parameter in it. Okay, so that should hopefully pull back a game object for us. Now, we're going to take this game object and actually translate it into the buttons. So buttons is the game state, and we want to be able to get it from the game object. So it would be nice if we could just say game object, get it from the JSON string, and be done. And that obviously doesn't work. We've got ourselves a string, and we're trying to put it into a button list. So what we need to do is deserialize this thing. So it is a string that has all the contents we need, but it just needs to be kind of unpacked. So we're going to use this same JSON convert method here, or this class. So I'm going to paste this in here, and let's see if there's anything else we can use. We can see deserialized object. That's the first thing that comes up. Perfect. Now, if we could just put parentheses around that and have the whole thing work, that would be wonderful. But of course, it's never that easy. So what's the error? It says, I cannot implicitly convert an object to a string. Are you missing a cast? So what's missing then is to translate this string into a list of buttons. That's what this thing is. So if you look at the top here, list of button model is the data type. So if I were to just copy that, we could borrow that and put it down inside a couple of angle brackets. I'm going to paste it in there and say, hey, that buttons is this data type, and so expect to translate it that way. All right, so now we're ready to send these buttons off to the next view. So let's go look at the view called results. And the results view was set up in the last video, and we were expecting a tuple or a tuple with a bool and a string value. So let's go back and see if we can make that happen. We created something like that up here at the top, so I'm going to copy and paste. We're almost there. So the results tuple is going to be a success. I guess we'll put just true for default. And the Json serialized buttons, that should work. And let's see, we're going to send off the results tuple into the next view. Did we do the same thing up here? We did not. So let's, instead of success, let's send that as results tuple. My goodness. That's a lot of code. I hope we did it right. Let's test it out and run it. Okay, so let's put in the correct URL. We get to the main window here, and I'm going to choose load game. And it does say success, so it loaded something. Let's go back and refresh the page, and you can see that the previous game that I had saved was all red. So you can test it out. You can like try a pattern, push save game. There's one more thing I'd like to add is a return maybe a link. So after we've gotten the results on the screen, let's put in a HTML action link here. So let's see if I type that right in. Action link it is, yes. So the things we need to put in here, first of all, the text. So this is return. So you can put anything you want there. And then the next thing is the index, which is the actual method. And then finally the controller, which is called the button controller. So they're a little bit backwards in their order, but that should work. Let's see if that helps us out. Okay, so I got this same thing again. Let's choose load game. And let's see what happens here. We get ourselves a success. And now when I click return, you can see that the previous version of the game is loaded. So let's check to see if we can do flags. I'm going to do save the game. Let's return, and let's try load game and return, and it does seem to catch everything. So we've got ourselves an exact version of how you can serialize an entire game board, save it into a database, and restore it. Now, probably some better things you could do is instead of just having a load game where it just does one game, you could maybe make a page that shows a list of all saved games, and then the user can select one by its ID number. So that would be a great solution. But this will get you started if you're trying to create a way to save and restore serialized data.